Ever download some cool new software, like really fired up to create something awesome? But then you just hit this like wall of menus and jargon. You're like, whoa, what is this?
Oh, yeah, I know that feeling, definitely.
Yeah, it gets overwhelming fast. But today we are diving into character animation in Unity, specifically the Animator Controller. And don't worry, this is not some crazy jargon-filled deep dive. We're going with you step by step.
Yeah, think of it more like a friendly guide, right?
Exactly. We're exploring this ebook. It's called An Introduction to Unity Animator Controller by Dylan LaCour. And what's great about Dylan's approach, at least for me, is he explains things in a way that makes you feel like he's right there with you, figuring it out as he goes.
Yeah, it's refreshing, honestly. He doesn't pretend to have all the answers. It's more like he's learning alongside the reader, which I really appreciate.
Totally.
Hmm.
And like a good friend, he's not afraid to point out those little gotchas, those things that can totally trip you up if you're not careful.
Yeah, exactly. Like those things you wish someone had told you before you spent hours banging your head against the wall.
Exactly. He actually starts off with some really practical advice, which I love, like the kind of stuff that those become a Unity master in a day courses often just skip over.
Yeah.
Like just choosing the right version of Unity can be surprisingly important.
Oh, totally crucial. That's something I wish I had known when I was starting out.
Right. He actually recommends beginners stick with the LTS versions,
Mm.
which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Like you don't want to be knee-deep in a project only to have some new Unity update come along and throw everything out of whack.
Yeah, exactly. And he smartly emphasizes this early on because it's something that a lot of newcomers, they might not even consider it.
Yeah, for sure.
And while we're talking about setting yourself up for success, another golden nugget he drops early on is about project organization.
Oh my gosh, yes. Organization. This was a hard-won lesson for me, I'll tell you.
Same here.
Like keeping your Unity project files separate from everything else, it just seems so basic. But you would be amazed how quickly things can turn into a chaotic mess if you don't.
It's so true. I've definitely learned that the hard way.
So true.
It's all about building good habits early on, right? Which is something that Dylan really stresses in the book. Like,
Yeah.
even something as simple as creating dedicated folders for your scenes. It might seem basic, but trust me, those little things, they add up.
Oh, they totally add up.
And they can save you so much frustration later on.
100% agree. It's like having a designated place for everything, right? So you're not frantically searching for that one file when you need it most.
Exactly. Especially when you're on a deadline.
Oh yeah, talk about stress. So okay, we've got our Unity version sorted, we've channeled our inner Marie Kondo and organized our project. Now it's time to get some characters in there, right?
Let's do it. Time to breathe some life into these digital beings.
Now Dylan uses two example characters in the book. There's Bjorn the Viking, and then there's this really cool robot named Romer. But don't worry, we're not going to get bogged down in the specifics of Vikings and robots here. We want to focus on those universal steps involved in getting any character ready for animation.
Right, because whether it's a Viking, a robot, or a giant talking banana, the fundamental process is pretty much the same.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
all about that foundation.
And this is where Dylan points out something that I think trips up a lot of beginners. It's this idea of really understanding materials.
Okay, so when you say materials,
Yeah.
you're not just talking about like whether my Viking is wearing leather armor or metal armor, right?
Right.
It's more than just the aesthetics.
It's so much more than just what's on the surface. In Unity, materials, they actually dictate how light interacts with your model. They influence the whole visual style, from like photorealism to something more stylized.
Okay, so it really affects how the final character looks.
Massively. It's those subtle details that really elevate the final look. It's the difference between a character looking like a plastic toy and something that feels like it belongs in a real world.
That makes a lot of sense. It's those details that you might not even consciously notice, but they make a huge difference.
Exactly. Now, Dylan does go into detail about all the different material types, which is super helpful. But what I found particularly insightful was how he highlighted this issue of embedded materials. Basically, sometimes those material settings are baked directly into those 3D model files, the FBX files.
FBX, just for anyone who's new to this, think of it like a standard file format for 3D models and animations, kind of like a universal language for 3D stuff,
Precisely. It keeps things consistent when you're moving assets between different software.
Right.
But here's the thing about those embedded materials. While they seem convenient at first, they can actually cause a real headache down the line, especially if you want to make changes or tweak things.
I'll see how that would be a pain.
Yeah, you're kind of stuck with those initial settings.
So it's better to have them separate.
Exactly. And Dylan does a great job of pointing this out. Honestly, it's something I wish I had known earlier on.
It's always those little things, right?
Yeah,
But thankfully, Dylan's got our backs. He provides solutions for those gotchas.
always. He wouldn't leave us hanging.
Okay, so we've main-gated the sometimes treacherous world of materials. What's our next step in prepping our character for animation?
This is where we introduce the concept of a prefab.
A prefab. Now, that sounds a bit like something out of Star Trek.
Maybe. But in the Unity world, it's actually a super useful tool. Think of it as a master template for your character.
Okay, so instead of setting up the same character model like a dozen times for different scenes or animations, we create this prefab, which is like a blueprint that we can just easily duplicate and reuse.
Exactly. You got it. Once you have your character with all its settings, components, everything just right, you create a prefab of it. That way you don't have to set everything up from scratch every time you want that character to appear in your project.
Oh, wow. That's a huge time saver.
Huge. Honestly, prefabs are a game changer, especially as your projects get more complex.
Okay, prefabs. Got it. Sounds like a lifesaver. So we got our characters imported, materials all sorted out, prefabs ready to go. Now, how do we actually make these characters move? Let's get to the animation itself.
Yes. And no mystical incantations needed, I promise.
And that's a relief. Although, that would be kind of cool, right? Maybe another time.
Haha, for sure. Another time.
So if it's not magic, then how does it actually work?
All right, so to make characters move in Unity, we use something called a rig.
A rig.
Yeah, think of it like a digital skeleton for your character.
Okay, so instead of like animating every single point on my Viking's beard, which sounds incredibly tedious, the rig gives me a structured way to control his movements.
You got it. The rig, it defines those underlying structures, the bones, the joints, all those points that allow for movement. It's a way more efficient and intuitive way to animate.
So it's kind of like a puppet in a way.
Exactly. You're controlling the puppet with this underlying structure.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So where do we even get these rigs? Do we have to build them ourselves, or does Unity provide some pre-built options?
That's a great question, and luckily, Unity often provides us with those tools and shortcuts to make our lives easier. While you can create rigs from scratch, it's definitely a more advanced topic. And Dylan doesn't really delve into that in this particular book. He focuses on a more, let's say, beginner-friendly approach, which is using pre-built rigs or even modifying existing ones.
Okay, so it's kind of like customizing a pre-made outfit rather than like sewing it from scratch.
Exactly. It's a great way to put it, especially when you're just starting out.
It's a good place to start. But even with a pre-built rig, how do we actually tell Unity how to use it with our specific character model?
That is the question, isn't it? And that's where those animation files come in, the ones we talked about earlier, those FBX files. Remember, they actually contain the movements for our character.
Right, so like those walk cycles, attack animations, all that good stuff.
Exactly. It's all in those FBX files.
But how do we actually connect those animations to the rig itself? It's like having a puppet and a set of instructions, but then you still need to figure out how to actually make the puppet move according to those instructions.
That's a fantastic analogy. And you're exactly right. It's about bridging that gap between the animation data and the rig itself. And Unity actually makes this process surprisingly smooth with its humanoid rig system.
Humanoid rig. So is that like a universal blueprint for characters in Unity or something?
You got it. It's designed to understand that basic structure of a two-legged character. Arms, legs, head, the usual suspects.
Okay, so it doesn't matter if my character is like a hulking Viking or a sleek robot. As long as they've got that basic humanoid structure, this rig system can understand how to animate them.
Exactly. And this is super powerful because it means you can potentially take animations designed for one character and apply them to another character.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. So you don't have to animate everything from scratch every single time.
Right. It's a huge time saver, especially as your projects grow.
That's incredible. So how does this humanoid rig actually work in practice?
Well, Dylan highlights a three-step process.
All right, let's hear it.
First thing you got to do is import your animation, again, that FBX file, into your Unity project.
Okay, so that's step one.
Step two, you're going to convert that animation to work with Unity's humanoid rig system.
So we're basically translating those animation instructions into a language that the humanoid rig can understand.
Precisely. You got.
But what if my character is a little, let's say, unconventional? What if he has like an extra arm or something? Does that completely throw a wrench into things?
You'd think so, right. But that's the beauty of this humanoid rig. It's flexible. You can actually customize it. There's a whole process of mapping the bones in your character model to the corresponding bones in that humanoid rig.
So it's like we're fine-tuning the translation to make sure that everything lines up perfectly.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Cool. So it's all about precision here.
Precisely. And Dylan does warn us about some potential gotchas during this bone mapping process, because even a tiny misalignment can have some pretty, well, sometimes funny, sometimes frustrating consequences in the final animation.
Oh, I can imagine. So instead of my Viking, like, dramatically drawing its sword, he ends up scratching his head or something.
Exactly. It's like that butterfly effect, right? A small error in the bone mapping can cascade into a much bigger problem in the animation. He actually uses this great example in the book about a finger bone on this popular rig called Mixamo, and it just highlights how important it is to really double-check every single bone connection, making sure it's mapped correctly.
Okay, so attention to detail is critical here. We wouldn't want to skip our morning coffee before tackling this bone mapping process.
Definitely not. This is detail-oriented work, for sure.
But once we've got those bones all mapped out correctly, we're good to go.
Almost. Remember, we've imported the animation, we've told Unity how to apply it to our character's rig, but how do we actually control when and how those animations play? That's where the Animator Controller comes in.
Ah, the Animator Controller, the puppet master of it all.
Exactly. Think of it as the control panel for all your character's movements. It's where you define how all those movements flow together, how your character transitions between different actions, and really importantly, how they respond to things happening in the game world.
So if I want my Viking to go from standing guard to pulling out his axe and charging into battle, the Animator Controller is where I'd set up that whole sequence.
You got it. But here's the really cool part. It's not just about playing back those animations in a fixed order. With the Animator Controller, we can actually create these dynamic systems where our characters react realistically to things. And they can even make decisions based on input from the player or events happening in the game world.
Okay, now we're talking. That sounds super powerful. How do we actually go about creating those dynamic animation systems?
It all starts with understanding two key concepts: animation clips and state machines.
Animation clips and state machines. Right, stay with me here.
Don't worry, they're not as intimidating as they sound. Think of an animation clip like a single self-contained action. So your Viking raising an eyebrow, swinging his axe, doing a victory dance, it's all broken down into these individual clips.
Okay, so instead of having like one massive animation file for my entire character, we've got these bite-sized animation clips that we can then piece together to create different actions.
Exactly. It's like having this whole library of movements to choose from.
That makes a lot of sense. And then the state machines, that's where we get to actually control those clips, right?
You got it. They give us a way to visually organize and control how those clips play out. Imagine like a flow chart with boxes for each state. So you might have an idle state, a walk state, and a tack state. And then arrows connecting them showing the possible transitions between those states.
So if my Viking's just chilling in the idle state, like just kind of looking around, and I press the W key on my keyboard to make him walk, I would create a transition from that idle state to the walk state in this state machine.
Exactly. And the beauty is you can have multiple transitions leading out of a state. So maybe holding down the shift key while you press W triggers our run animation instead of just a regular walk. It gives you so much control and flexibility.
This is starting to sound a lot less like computer science and a lot more like that choose-your-own-adventure book I loved as a kid. Except now, I get to control a Viking instead of just doing pages.
That's a fantastic way to think about it. And that sense of control and possibility is really at the heart of what makes the Animator Controller so powerful.
It's like we're conducting an orchestra of animation.
Exactly. You're in control of this complex system that brings your character to life.
This has been awesome. We've covered so much ground already, from the importance of choosing the right version of Unity to the nitty-gritty of bone mapping, and now unlocking the power of the Animator Controller. It's amazing to see how these concepts all build on each other, like we're laying the foundation for truly expressive and engaging character animation.
Absolutely. And the best part is, this is really just the beginning. As you get more comfortable with the fundamentals that Dylan lays out in his book, you'll discover a whole world of creative possibilities within Unity's animation system.
So, to all of you listening, I'm curious. What stories will you tell through animation? What unique characters will you bring to life with these newfound skills? I, for one, can't wait to see what you create. Happy animating, everyone. All right, so before we went on this whole tangent about materials, we were diving into the world of rigs and how they make animating characters in Unity so much easier.
Right, like way easier than trying to animate every single vertex by hand.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it. But where do these rigs actually come from? Do we have to create them from scratch, or does Unity like provide some kind of pre-built options?
Well, that's the beauty of Unity. It often gives us these tools and shortcuts. You can create rigs from scratch, which is like a whole other level. But Dylan focuses on a much more beginner-friendly approach in the book. He walks you through using pre-built rigs or even like modifying existing ones.
Oh, okay. So it's more like customizing a pre-made outfit than like sewing it from scratch, right?
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Makes sense, especially for those of us who are, just starting out with all this. But even with a pre-built rig, how do we tell Unity? How do we tell it to actually use it with our specific character model?
That is the million-dollar question, right? And this is where those animation files that we talked about before come in, those FBX files. Because remember, those files, those actually contain the movements for our character.
Right. So like all those walk cycles and attack animations, all that good stuff, that's all baked into those files.
Exactly. All that juicy animation data.
But how do we actually connect those animations to the rig? It's like having a puppet and a set of instructions, but you still have to figure out how to actually make the puppet move according to those instructions.
Yeah. I love that analogy. You're spot on. It's about making that connection between the animation data and the rig itself. And Unity makes this surprisingly smooth, actually, with its humanoid rig system.
Humanoid rig. Okay, so what is that? Is that like a universal blueprint for characters in Unity or something?
You got it. It's designed to understand the basic structure of a two-legged character, right? So like arms, legs, head, all those essential parts.
Okay, so it doesn't matter if my character is like a big hulking Viking or like a sleek robot. As long as they've got that basic humanoid structure, this rig system can kind of figure out how to animate them.
Exactly. And this is what's so powerful about it because it means that you can potentially take animations that were designed for one character and apply them to a totally different character.
Whoa, really? That is super cool. So you don't have to animate everything from scratch for every single character. You can kind of mix and match.
Precisely. It's a huge time saver, especially when you're working on bigger projects.
That is amazing. So how does this humanoid rig actually work in practice? Like, what are the steps involved?
Well, Dylan highlights this three-step process in the book.
All right, lay it on me.
First thing you do is you got to import your animation as that FBX file into your Unity project.
Okay, that's step one.
Step two, you're going to convert that animation to work with Unity's humanoid rig system.
So we're essentially like translating those animation instructions into a language that the humanoid rig can understand.
Yes, perfectly put.
But what if my character is a little bit, unconventional? Like what if he has an extra arm or something? Does that completely mess things up?
You'd think so, right? But here's the beauty of the humanoid rig. It's actually super flexible. You can customize it. There's this whole process of mapping the bones in your character model to the corresponding bones in that humanoid rig.
So it's like we're fine-tuning the translation, making sure that everything lines up perfectly.
Exactly. You're essentially telling Unity, okay, this bone in my character's model, that's the same as this bone in the humanoid rig.
Okay, cool. Sounds pretty straightforward.
It can be, but Dylan does warn about some potential gotchas during this bone mapping process, because even a tiny little misalignment can have these, well, sometimes funny, sometimes frustrating consequences for your animation.
Oh, no, I can imagine. So, like, instead of my Viking dramatically drawing his sword, he ends up, like, scratching his head or something.
Exactly. It's like the butterfly effect. A small mistake in the beginning can lead to some pretty wild results later on. He uses this really good example in the book about a finger bone on this popular rig called Mixamo. And it just highlights how crucial it is to double-check, triple-check every single bone connection to make sure it's mapped to the right spot.
Okay, so attention to detail is critical here. Definitely don't want to be chugging coffee and rushing through this bone mapping stage.
Not a good idea.
But once we've got those bones all mapped out correctly, then we're good to go, right? Time to animate.
Almost. We've imported the animation. We've told Unity how it maps onto our character's rig. But how do we actually control when and how those animations play? Like, how do we make it all come together?
Right, because we don't want our Viking just randomly cycling through all his animations at once. That would be chaotic.
Exactly. And that is where the Animator Controller comes in.
Ah, the Animator Controller. It's like the puppet master, the director of it all.
You got it. It's like the control panel for all your character's movements. It's where you define how those movements all flow together, how your character transitions between different actions, and probably most importantly, how they respond to things that are happening in the game world.
Okay, so if I want my Viking to go from just like standing guard to suddenly pulling out his axe and charging into battle.
Yeah.
The animator controller is where I'd set up that whole sequence.
Precisely. But here's what makes it so cool. It's not just about playing those animations back in like a fixed order. The animator controller lets us create these dynamic systems where our characters react realistically. And they can even make decisions based on input from the player or things that are happening around them in the game world.
Okay, now that is awesome. That sounds super powerful, but how do we actually go about creating these dynamic animation systems?
Well, it all boils down to understanding two key concepts: animation clips and state machines.
Animation clips, state machine. Okay, I'm intrigued, but I'm not going to lie, those sound a little intimidating.
I promise they're not as scary as they sound. Stick with me here. Think of an animation clip like a single self-contained action. So like your Viking raising an eyebrow, swinging his axe, maybe doing a little victory dance. It's all broken down into these individual clips.
Okay, so instead of having like one massive animation file for my whole character, I've got these bite-sized animation clips that I can then piece together to create different actions. Is that right?
Exactly. It's like having this library of movements to choose from.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So then what about those state machines? That's where we get to actually like control those clicks, right?
You got it. The state machine gives us this really cool way to visually organize and control how those clips all play out. Imagine like a flowchart, right? With boxes for each state. So you might have an idle state, a walk state, an attack state, and then you've got these arrows connecting the boxes, showing the possible transitions between those states.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So if my Viking is just hanging out in the idle state, like just kind of chilling there, and I press let's say the W key on my keyboard to make him walk, I would create a transition from the idle state to the walk state in this state machine.
You nailed it. That's exactly how it works. And the beauty is you can have like multiple transitions leading out of a single state, right? So maybe if you hold down the shift key while you're pressing W, it triggers a run animation instead of that regular walk cycle.
Well, that's so cool. So we can create all these different possibilities for how our characters move and react.
Precisely. It's all about having options and flexibility.
This is starting to feel a lot less like computer science and a lot more like that Choose Your Own Adventure book I had as a kid.
Right, except now you're controlling a Viking instead of just turning pages.
Exactly. And I got to say, I think I like this version better. All right, so we've rigged our characters, we've mapped those bones, and now it's time to unleash the maestro of animation.
The Animator Controller. Our animation maestro, ready to conduct this symphony of movement.
Right. Animator Controller, it does sound kind of intimidating, though, like something you need a computer science degree for.
I get it, it sounds very official, but honestly, it's way more intuitive than the name might suggest. Think of it like the control panel, right? For all your character's movements.
Okay, so if I want my Viking to seamlessly go from just like standing guard to whipping out his axe and charging into battle, the animator controller is where I'd set up that whole sequence.
Precisely. You got it. But here's the really cool part. It's not just about playing back those animations in like a straight line, a fixed order. With the animator controller, you can create these dynamic systems where the characters are actually reacting to things. They can make decisions based on what the player is doing, or even like events that are happening around them in the game world.
Okay, so we're not just talking about like pre-programmed robots here. These characters can actually react and respond to things.
Exactly. It's all about bringing those characters to life and making them feel like a real part of the game world.
That's awesome. So how do we actually go about creating these dynamic animation systems? What's the secret sauce?
Well, it all starts with wrapping your head around two key concepts: animation clips and state machines.
Animation clips and state machines. All right, I'm listening.
Don't worry, they're not as complicated as they sound. Think of an animation clip like a single action, like one thing your character can do. So it could be your Viking raising an eyebrow, swinging his axe, maybe doing a little victory dance, whatever you can dream up. But the point is, each of these actions is broken down into these individual self-contained clips.
Okay, so it's like instead of having this one massive file for all my characters' animations, it's broken down into these smaller, bite-sized clips that we can then kind of piece together, right?
You got it. It's like having this library of movements that you can then pick and choose from to create all sorts of different actions and reactions.
That makes a lot of sense. So then where did these state machines come into play? That's where we actually get to control those clips, right?
Exactly. State machines give us this really cool visual way to organize and control how those clips actually play out in the game. Imagine, like, I don't know, a flowchart with boxes representing each state your character can be in. So you might have a box for idle, a box for walk, a box for attack, you name it. And then you have these arrows connecting those boxes, which show the possible transitions between each of those states.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So if my Viking is just standing there in his idle state, just kind of chilling, and then I press let's say the W key on my keyboard to make him walk, I would basically create a transition from that idle state to the walk state in this state machine. Is that right?
Exactly, you're getting it. And the really cool part is you can have multiple transitions leading out of a single state.
Hmm.
So you can have it set up so that if you just tap W, the Viking does like a slow walk. But if you hold down Shift while you're pressing W, it triggers that run animation instead.
Oh, that's awesome. So we can give players all sorts of ways to interact with the characters and control how they move.
Precisely. It's all about options and flexibility and really making those characters come to life.
This has been amazing. I feel like we've gone from 0 to 60 with character animation in Unity.
Right. We've covered a ton of ground.
We talked about choosing the right version of Unity, organizing our projects, diving deep into materials, figuring out rigs, and now we've even unlocked the power of the Animator Controller.
And honestly, that's what I love about game development. There's always something new to learn. You can go as deep as you want with any of these topics.
Absolutely. It's a constant journey of exploration and discovery, but that's what makes it so rewarding. So to everyone listening, we've shared some tools and insights today, but now it's your turn. What stories will you tell? What characters will you bring to life using these techniques? We can't wait to see what you create.